Hello and welcome to Wrestling and Everything Coast to Coast with your host, Buddy Sotelo Esquire, wrestling's premier photographer, Dr. Mike Lano, and esteemed executive producer, Evan Ginsberg. And we have a very special guest tonight. Dr. Mike, would you like to introduce him?
Thank you. We are honoring our brother, somebody that is irreplaceable. Every time we lose somebody, it's rough. It's rough on us, but this was a dear brother, a guy who was so beloved. And his boss, person he worked with at Wrestling Perspective, David Skolnick, is with us. He was just talking about going out to dinner after a Weekend of Champions convention in 92 or 93 with Evan. But guys, we're talking about Ed, also known for your publication as Phantom of the Ring. And he had done so much. So we were just talking about Wrestling Eye magazine was the first U.S. magazine to sort of duplicate what Japan was doing in discussing intelligently and shoot, no BS, no made-up interviews, made-up storylines, kissing up to the promotions. But Ed, what can you tell us about those days with Ed? Because in my opinion, working for him, he was the best, the first and the best editor there ever. And it was such a unique, different looking magazine. And that was Ed's touch. And Ed just passed away, I should say, about a week ago. It'll be 2 weeks this Thursday. He had fought brilliantly and lost a leg a number of years ago. And we had him on the show, Ev, right after that to keep his mind off of it. And Evan knew him as well. We're all close to him. And but he had, salivary gland.
Well, I actually have never met him. I'd like to put an asterisk there. I didn't know him personally.
I know you respect people who achieve greatness in magazines and newsletters, and we're not talking, this was in the era, the grand era of newsletters, which we'll get into. But let me start with Dave Skolnick first on Wrestling Eye magazine and what made that unique. And when did you meet him, too?
Ed was a very interesting guy in that I have known Ed since 1991, and we've actually never met. Wherever I was, he was always in a different place, and so. But we would talk on the phone, sometimes weekly, at least monthly, going on 30 years. And my first exposure to Ed was not knowing that it was Ed Garea, but reading Wrestling Eye when I was in high school and college, and it was like, I couldn't believe what I was reading, and he would tell me years later that he received like significant backlash from people in the industry, that he was exposing the business, which is kind of silly in hindsight, because basically what he was doing was telling people about the inner workings of an industry to people who were interested in doing it. It was a much more mass audience than let's say a niche newsletter. But like that, I first met Ed for Ringside Reflector, J.D. McKay's old newsletter, which had just folded. We had started in 1990, and my partner at the time, Paul MacArthur, said, we should get Phantom Ring, from Wrestling Eye and Ringside Reflector to write for us. And I was like, this guy's never going to write for us. This guy was like, big name back, just a few years ago. Contacted him, and he knew us, knew of us, and he agreed to write for us. And it was just a thrill of a lifetime. And he was really, not only just a wonderful person, but so giving, such a mentor, taught me so much about everything. Wrestling, life, always just so incredibly supportive of me. And, it's just so devastating to lose him, particularly since, we have been so incredibly close and you would think that after we stopped in 2008 doing Wrestling Perspective, that we'd kind of fall, out of touch with each other. But we actually became significantly closer in the past, I would want to say, 15 years. We did a film website together for 5 years, which was just a joy to do. And he was just such an incredibly knowledgeable person about so many different subjects. And like I said, it's just such an incredible loss for me personally. But just for people who were wrestling fans who don't know the importance of Phantom of the Ring of Ed Garea. He was so instrumental in bringing, removing the silliness of kayfabe, and making, pulling back the curtain and just showing us, the fascinating inner workings of professional wrestling for so many years.
Ev was part of that too, because there was a plethora of newsletters, not just, and I think they kind of came birthed out of fan club newsletters or news bulletins from the 60s and 70s. And then we have these newsletters. And obviously there was Observer, whatever that year that was, early 83 or mid 83. But then all the other ones, Torch, and later Figure 4. But we had genres. We had, if you wanted nostalgia, history, and everything else, you went to Evan Ginsberg's Wrestling Then and Now. If you wanted comedy,
Evan and I both started our newsletters both in 1990, right, Evan?
Yes, exactly.
Within like maybe just a few weeks or a month of each other, because we started in like February of 1990, and you were right around the exact same time.
Yeah, it was definitely 1990. I don't remember the exact month, but yeah.
Well, Paul and I were arrogant enough that we started getting newsletters in like September, October of 1989, reading them and thinking, oh, we can do this. And within like 4 or 5 months of getting newsletters, we were putting one out ourselves. Which in hindsight, I think people in their early 20s are the only ones who have that self-confidence / arrogance to actually think that, oh, well, I'm reading something, I could do a better job than these people are doing. No problem, and go ahead and to not be modest, actually did it better than most of them did it. And
I want to throw it in, but I want to say Perspective was intelligent commentary and breakdown, not just of shows and promotions, but then you had Ed, who didn't want, I guess he was shy, because if you look at his Facebook page, it's just that mass photo of him. I think Kat, his wife, who passed away.
I'm sorry. It took me until 6 years ago for him to finally agree to send me a photo of himself. So, I knew him.
Wow.
So I knew him for like 25, 26 years, and he still would never see a photo of himself. And he finally agreed to. It was like it was my 50th birthday present. So it was 6 years ago. He finally sent me a photo of himself, and I don't know what the big secret was, but even like when we did the movie website together, he didn't want to use his real name. He just was such a modest guy. Really did not want to take credit for anything under his real name, which was, I was one who convinced him, for that to use his real name. I'm like, no one's going to know what the hell a Phantom of the Ring is when we're writing about film. And he was agreeable. He got a kick out of having some notoriety of that. He could have had such more significant notoriety in wrestling had he used his real name.
What are your thoughts on this too? So your Wrestling Then and Now was way more than just nostalgia and discussion of legends, because there was current stuff in there, and Perspective had Ed as the Phantom, often poking fun at the ridiculousness of stuff like the Black Scorpion angle in WCW 91, 92, humor, his Fanny Awards, which kind of poked fun at the Observer ultra serious annual wrestling awards. But Ev, your thoughts on everything?
Well, I think people really don't know the history of sheets, which most people would call zines, but wrestling people, we always refer to it as sheets. But where did the term come from? You know, dirt sheet. It was really, breaking kayfabe, like David said, was a big deal back in the day, and not everybody welcomed us with open arms. And in my sheet or newsletter, we had Killer Kowalski writing a column. So at some point, legends and other people said this is okay. And I think people need to know that people like Ed Garea from Wrestling Perspective and Wrestling Eye were pioneers and really helped change the business and did not profit monetarily from it like so many have. And at bare minimum, I think it's important to acknowledge and recognize him. And before I forget, we lost another historian the same week as Ed, Vince Edwards. He did Mass Decisions, the Triangular Life of Dick the Destroyer, Dick the Destroyer Bias. So, you lost two historians in the course of maybe 3 or 4 days. And, very little acknowledgement. I don't know what Meltzer did or didn't do as far as these two gentlemen, but I know that Ed Garea helped Meltzer a lot as well early on, and he should have gotten some sort of, kudos. And, this is a pioneer who helped change the business, I believe, for the better. I mean, I think it was almost silly, some of the newsstand magazines, as fun as they were, but some of the articles were absurd. And, so somebody like Ed took it to a whole different level, plus the fact that the guy was a legitimately good writer. People don't understand that in wrestling, the fans don't even grasp that a bombardment of information and rumors and scoops, that's not necessarily writing. What Ed did was writing, and again, acknowledge this, because you could count the great writers in wrestling on maybe 2 hands, maybe, and Ed was one of them. And, nothing but respect. And I'm glad we're doing this, because most people in the industry either ignored his passing or it was a very brief sentence or two, and he deserved much more. He helped take the newsstand magazines in a more mature, professional, realistic direction, and he helped do the same with the sheets. So, early on, a lot of the sheets were really just a bombardment of results and clips. And I mean, Ed helped take it, and David, of course, as the editor, helped take it to a whole different level. And, respect. And this is part of wrestling history that's not readily acknowledged.
Let me say one quick thing that Russ, I asked David about Paul MacArthur, and he's too grief-stricken. I asked David when we talked about 6 hours ago if we could include anybody else from Perspective or from Ed's past. And what Meltzer did put out on the Observer website was, with a couple of sentences he wrote, is basically verbatim what I sent him, and he asked me for more information, at least to keep him up to date. So I do have to give Meltzer his credit that he wanted to, if there was a service, I told him if I hear of a service and or like a charity, a cancer charity, something from his sister who had texted me hours after he passed about it, and then I got that out there. So let me throw it back to you. Let me ask Russell, though, because I don't know, Russ, were you ever getting like the newsletters? Because in our time, when we're talking primarily from like mid or say 86 on through the 90s,
No,
early
busy with college.
2000s.
Busy with college. Didn't, and really wrestling was still something that you read about in the big magazines, or you didn't read about it at all, or you saw it when it came on TV. So yeah, no, I never got involved in the sheets. And really, now that the internet is what it is, everybody has a voice, and it's sort of taken away from the exclusiveness of wrestling writers. And so, Ed was sort of in an era that no longer exists. I mean, maybe like he was like the best whalebone corset designer that you could ask for, because these days you just don't have that sort of thing anymore. And so I think that he stood out in an era when you could stand out in that way, but nowadays I think it's hard for people to relate.
Yeah, I mean, he was just a groundbreaking pioneer, and he just he understood what his audience wanted. Where you would read the Aftermath magazines, and everything was just totally made up. Because interestingly enough, I used to work with Dave Rosenbaum at a newspaper for 5 years, from 1990 to 95, and he was still freelancing for PWI and all the other magazines. And I mean, I knew that everything was made up, but he would like knock out like 8 or 9 articles in a day, just because there wasn't really anything. There was no analysis. There was no thought. It was creative writing. And you took what you saw on TV, and you just kind of would write something a little silly about it, 400 or 500 words, and then move on to the next one, and you could just like I said, knock those things out, a bunch of them in a day. Whereas Ed always thought of professional wrestling not on a very serious level. I mean, because it's kind of difficult to think of professional wrestling as something, it's not philosophy. It's not history. It's not something that is pertinent to. It's not pertinent to your everyday life. It's a fun recreational thing. But he approached it with a great sense of humor, and with a way of educating his audience in an entertaining way. And you don't really even see that much to this day. And like as we were talking earlier about the sheets used to be heavily results oriented, and now it just seems to be a lot of backstage gossip type of things. And Ed was more interested in, here's something really ridiculous that they're trying to portray as something serious. Now let me kind of goof on it and give some insight into what's going on, but do it in a very humorous way, and not necessarily make fun of wrestling. I don't think that was ever his point, but the absurdity of some things that people try to pass along as being legitimate, he would say, well, this is just utterly ridiculous. Let me break it down here into something humorous that you'll learn and you'll also laugh. And I think that was always very important to him.
Let me say one thing too. Ed talked to the boys. I think he was talking to Bruno almost as long as I did behind the scenes on a regular basis, hearing a lot of those stories. Ed would love and say, is this exactly how Bruno told you? And he would ask me about, for example, how McMahon Sr. got him banned when he was first complaining about Buddy Rogers, I'm guessing 61, mistreating and abusing the enhancement talent, the jobbers. And so, as this, Russ has heard me talk about this many times, so McMahon gets banned from most every office, and he's backstage at the Cow Palace ready to go out there and work for Roy Shire against Ray Stevens. And Roy comes back and says, in essence, I'm sorry, I just got the word from Vince Sr. I'm not able to use you. So Bruno went for nearly 2 years and was selling out. The only promoter he could work for was Tunney, who ignored the ban and allowed him to work in main event. And he was getting over selling out the houses at Maple Leaf Gardens. And Ed wanted to hear, and he's exactly what he told me, is he told Ed that Vince Sr. came up there and, kind of almost crawling back, asking him, because Rogers was not drawing the houses and gates, like the Rocca once was. The houses were going down with him as champion once they put the brand new created Capital Sports title, the Tri-WF on Rogers. It just wasn't working, and begged Bruno to come back, and, blah, blah, blah. And so one other thing I want to ask is, we were talking about wrestling radio, and Ed was very close with mutual friends of mine, and I know Evan and David would know these names, the late Bill Potshot Kunkel and Arnie Katz. I'm not sure how Arnie's doing. I'm hoping he's doing fine. They actually had, even before Apter, they had a wrestling radio show in '71. Apter came about at least 6-7 months after, and that's how he got his job soon after. I never called them the Apter magazines. They were the Stanley Weston magazines for me, because he was my boss. I loved and respected Stanley. Got to induct him at an LA Cauliflower Alley. With the only time he came out, was at my insistence, we give him an award. But do you guys remember, particularly Dave and maybe Ev, do you remember him on that show? I don't know what that show's name was. Tried to get a hold of Arnie to do the show. I wasn't getting anything back. At least his emails weren't bouncing back as invalid.
I don't remember him being on the show, but I think Bill used to write for us as well, and the two of them would. I'd have conversations with them, and I think they wrote a little about the time that they would do the radio shows, and Ed and Bill loved each other. They were total opposites in almost every way you can imagine, but they just when they got together and then they would talk, they just had the best times together. And I mean, Ed's three favorite wrestlers of all time were Bruno, Luthez, and Freddie Blassie, and that he was able to not only meet them and become friends with them, and he did an interview for Wrestling Perspective for us with Luthez, and it was just such an absolute thrill for him that here was a guy who he did love professional wrestling, and that he became such close friends with the three people who he grew up, absolutely idolizing, was such a thrill for him.
We were just talking, and then I want to pitch over to Evan about, so you and I were at the Weekend of Champions in New York, and John Arizzi, at least, my first one was 91. I don't know if you went to the 90, which was a little bit smaller. The big one was 1991. Bruno.
Yes, I was at 90, 91, and 92.
So he was with the vendor tables with Thez, Buddy Rogers, Ric Flair, Rick Rude, I think, Nancy Benoit, Nancy Sullivan was pretty much there. I think Johnny Valiant would be the autograph. Yeah, there was a ton, but Ev, so was Ed at any of those, 91, 92?
No, he was not. No. Like I said, I knew him for 30-something years and never had the pleasure of actually, meeting him face to face, which, it's so hard to imagine. So someone who's probably one of your 3 or 4 closest friends in the entire
world. It's like me and Russell. Me and Russell have never met, and we're going to try to keep it that way. Yes.
3,000 miles is about as much as we can get distance from each other. We can move a little bit more to the left or to the right to just make that 3,000 miles and 12 inches.
A buddy of mine, he broke up with his girlfriend and she moved to Alaska because Siberia wasn't an option. This is a true story. I couldn't make this up.
But just speaking about our mutual friend of Ed Garia's, and this is a show tribute to Ed Garea and his life. He just passed, and he was fine, and then developed like a swelling in his cheek. David, his sister said, and then he had to go to emergency. He was puffing up, and then 2 months later he passed. It was salivary gland tumor, which can sometimes be serious. Blockage.
He like I said, he was such an exceptionally private person, and but occasionally he would open up, and he had medical problems dating back to the early 2000s. He was coming home, getting off the subway, and he got hit by a car, and that's what caused the serious problems with his legs initially. And then his wife, Kat, had passed in 2007 or 2008.
2008, yeah, 2008.
Yeah, and so at that point, Ed's health had deteriorated, and they were basically, taking care of each other. When she passed, he ended up shortly thereafter moving to Texas with his sister, Jane, and it was very difficult for him because he wasn't around friends. He wasn't working anymore. I don't know if many people know, but Ed worked for the Internal Revenue Service for 28 years. He was a public information officer for most of that time. So he was, so he got to know a lot of reporters at the Daily News, at the New York Post, at the New York Times, and they would call the Manhattan office for various information that they would need about IRS stuff, and Ed was that point person for them for so many years, and so he was away. He had to leave his job because of his health. Went down there. Was struggling with his health problems for so many years, but with the cancer, with Salvatore, it just happened so fast. I was speaking with him probably 4 or so weeks before he passed, and he told me about it, and I could hear a tiny little bit of slurring in his voice, and I said, I asked him, I said, is there something wrong with your mouth? And he says, yeah, it's because of the cancer. It's in his mouth and his ear. And I could still understand him. And then we probably spoke about every 4 or 5 days at that point. And pretty much, I mean, it just happened so incredibly fast. Like 2 weeks before his passing, we were talking, and I really couldn't make out much of anything he was saying. I mean, the cancer had just impacted him so incredibly fast. And the last time I spoke to him would have been the Sunday. He died on a Thursday, and it was the Sunday before he passed. And I mean, I just knew that. I couldn't understand hardly anything he was saying. It had gotten to such a severe level, and I knew that this was definitely going to be the last time I was ever going to speak to him. And I mean, it just, to this day, it still breaks my heart, and it's just so incredibly difficult to think about. But the last thing I did say to him was that I love you, Ed, and I could make out him saying I love you too. And I'm a grandfather of two beautiful girls who were born January 2nd and June 9th. And I mean, all he wanted to talk about was my grandkids. And he was just such an incredibly caring, giving person, the most unselfish person you could ever imagine. And it just, like I said, when I spoke to him on Sunday, I knew that was the end. And Paul had not spoken to him in a few months, and he didn't know how severe it was. And I had called Paul right away and told him, I said, you may want to call him, though it's going to be impossible to make anything out, but you may want to make some contact with him. And so Paul ended up writing what he told me was like a 4-page handwritten letter to Ed, just talking about the times when they were so close, and how he hoped for his recovery. And unfortunately, he passed on a Thursday, and the letter arrived on Friday. So Ed never got to see it. And he just was just such a remarkable person. And like I said, just gave of himself and was so unselfish. And just on a personal level, helped me become such a better person. And on a professional level, I've been a newspaper reporter for 35 years. So I've been writing for a very long time, and Ed was always exceptionally supportive, even to days before his passing. And he would read my stuff and have, not only would he get some of the subtleties of some of the things I was writing, but he would actually still offer me very friendly advice on what to look for, what style points, how to write, how to be a little more approachable, a little more entertaining, a little more humorous in what I wrote, particularly with columns. I mean, like I said, I never spoke to anybody who had such a great understanding of just how to write and how to reach an audience as Ed did, and with the amazing institutional knowledge that he had. Because I mean, everyone now can be an historian on wrestling. It's there's hundreds of books. You could
they can call themselves historians,
right? And anyone could call themselves an historian. Ed was doing legwork in the 80s, when there was no internet, where you basically had to go to firsthand sources, and they're not always terribly reliable. I mean, I've heard some people who have critiqued his ability to accurately portray history, but as history is told by those who survive. So you have to take the word of people who lived through it, and sometimes their memories are a little faulty. Sometimes if you I remember as a kid looking through the daily, going to Madison Square Garden and seeing a show, and then seeing the results a day or two later, on the sports page in the tiny little section of the Daily News, and a bunch of the results were wrong. So so for someone to actually do the legwork, go to libraries, looking through old newspaper articles from the 30s and 40s, and talking to people who had lived through the 40s and 50s in professional wrestling to document what happened. I mean, now all the stuff, and I don't know how reliable it is now, is all sitting there at your fingertips on a computer. Ed was actually doing the legwork that is been long forgotten.
I'm going to throw to Evan, but I want to ask him about Ed's mastery of film and TV, classic film and TV. But here, Dave, is from Susan Crawford, who was part of our group, Ed, a couple of years ago, or maybe a year and a half ago. Susan Crawford. I wanted to mention her because she's been a big help. And she was part of like not only his movie list, which might have been what you were doing with him, but also from his goddaughter, who was a police officer using it. She was a master of many MMA techniques, but I guess there was another goddaughter who was maybe I'm screwing that up, was the one doing the journalism in the paper.
She's a newspaper reporter.
I heard from Elise Skolnick, who had heard from Ed's sister, Jane, that he passed away. But she said that her group of people communicating with Ed on his email list had no idea at all of his wrestling. Nothing. I'm sitting here telling her for the first time, and she's spreading it to them. I'd originally been friends with his wife, good friends with his wife, Kat, before she passed in 2008. Often, if I called and she was out, I would chat for a long time with Ed. That guy loved I will always miss him. That's Susan. Yeah. So Evan, who has done all kinds of film, Wrestling Then and Now documentary, many other documentaries, Evan's book. Evan and I are doing the John and Chris Tolis book. David doesn't even know that yet. But Evan, do you recall ever talking to Ed about film? Because the two of you are whizzes on movies.
No, I don't remember speaking about film, but I just wanted to add something. In spite of all of the books, shoot interviews, mountains of information that's available, there's so many people that have these ridiculous misconceptions about pro wrestling, quote unquote. They all pissed away fortunes on wine, women, and song. And we know from legends in the business who are our friends, many of them never broke 100,000 in a year, while sending money back home to support their family, while paying road expenses, etc. So on. There's so much wrong information that's out there, and rewriting of history, quote unquote. He was just a jobber, and we know the guy as a champion in 20 different territories, but they remember him from 1985 in WWF or whatnot. So Ed was a real historian, a real writer who spoke to Bruno and Blassie and Fez, who went back to the 30s, okay? And Fez's mentor, who went back to the turn of the century, okay? That's a real historian, a real writer, a real journalist, a real researcher. Every day of the week, I see idiots go, The Undertaker was the greatest of all time. I go, you never saw wrestling you never saw wrestling before 1990. If this is your conclusion, I see this every day of the week. Okay, so again, a guy like Ed spent thousands and thousands of hours doing research, libraries, microfiche. This isn't a guy pulling up some ridiculous WWE list, the top 50 heels of all time, and Kowalski's number 50. If he
makes it, yeah.
Yeah, no, seriously. Years ago I saw that and my blood pressure skyrocketed. They had Kowalski 50 and The Miz is number 10 or whatnot. That's not history. That's propaganda. Ed was a historian, and David put out a wonderful publication, Wrestling Perspective. And let me just throw this in. What people don't understand today, wrestling's a big business. A lot of the clickbait boys are making big money out there. Okay, a lot of the merch guys are making big money. Ed did this out of love. Okay, he was not being paid for articles in a small newsletter. Okay, we all
did it out of love. Yeah,
we all doing it out of love and respect for the business and a passion for it. This wasn't mercenary. Okay, and for that reason, again, I want to go back to guys like Ed and Vince Evans, who did the Destroyer book, who died 2 or 3 days apart from Ed, I said before. These guys deserve being acknowledged. They really do. You know, as a writer, you know, I know what goes into writing a book. You know, that one Destroyer book, God knows how many hours does Vince Evans put in to the Destroyer book. I mean, you know, so let's acknowledge these guys more than just a sentence or two. You know, that all-important Raw or SmackDown or AEW show with thousands of people writing thousands of words. How about a little acknowledgement for guys like this? And much respect. Slam Wrestling acknowledges these guys. Mike Lano acknowledges these guys. Okay? I mean, there are people that do acknowledge them.
We're trying on this program. Trying on this podcast.
Half of the shows on this program are people who died, right, Russell? Seriously. I would say
half is maybe a nice estimate. It's more like 75%.
But it's important. It's important from many, many aspects, not just the history part.
Well, the WWE is never going to talk about Ed. You know, AEW is never going to talk about Ed.
We didn't even mention the guy who played Mantar, who did many things in ECW. Right. And WCW, and was the brother.
Another passing this week.
Even a photo of him in that ridiculous, and that wasn't even his fault. That lousy gimmick, you know, with Cornette managing him. Guy was talented and worked.
The poor guy fell down, and he posted on Facebook, "I fell down. They're going to put me in a brace." Next thing you know, he's dead. 55 years old. It's a shame.
He spent he did at least 3 to 4 tours for Otto Vaughn's lengthy European, Germany, and Austria tour. So he could work, but you just didn't see him when you're, you know, stuck when everybody had a horrible gimmick in the early to mid 90s.
Yeah. I mean, guys like Mike and guys like Ed, who go back, you know, decades and decades, you know, make me who goes from 1990s seem like a rookie in comparison. You know, I mean, Mike, you've been doing this since what, the 70s, right?
A little before that, when I was taking Polaroids at the Olympic Auditorium of Blassie when he hadn't even turned babyface yet, then became our biggest face. The 3 matches with the Sheik in Cage, and then the scientific 1-hour Broadway with Rocky Johnson fully turned him face. 1970.
I mean, I walked away from wrestling in 2008 when I stopped doing, you know, Perspective, and don't really follow it closely anymore. You know, there was a while where I just wasn't watching it at all, just because it just wasn't appealing to me in any way. But guys who are like us, who are old school guys, you know, we're you know, to most of the people who are so-called, you know, wrestling journalists or whatever, you know, we're dinosaurs. And so like Evan had said, you know, they think that like, you know, their Mount Rushmore is you know, is The Undertaker, Steve Austin, and The Rock, who were all, you know, fine talents. But I mean, you know, where's, you know, these guys have never heard of Dory Funk Jr. or Jack Briscoe or Lou Thez or Ed Strangle Lewis. I mean, obviously none of us were around to watch Ed Strangle Lewis, but we know the guy, and we know the guy's history, and we respect and appreciate it. And even, you know, guys like you know, great wrestlers like Kowalski and Carpentier, and you know, and guys who we either saw or you know, grew up knowing about, you know. And for a guy like you know, Evan and myself, seeing Bruno and Pedro, you know, and Billy Graham, you know, and living through that, and you ask a current fan right now, and they couldn't, you know, they wouldn't know who any of those people are.
But David, we see this sort of phenomenon going on with all sports. I mean, it isn't just wrestling.
You're right. You're
discussions about, football players and basketball players and baseball players. Not so much baseball players. I think baseball fans know the concept of like eras, and that baseball is kind of an era-less game. You don't compare eras with people. They just appreciate the accomplishments with the guys have gotten. But I see it in a lot of other sports discussions, especially football and basketball.
Right.
It's the same thing in wrestling.
Greatest basketball player.
With the NFL, if you ask even somebody in LA who Roman Gabriel is, they'll be clueless. A current NFL fan, they won't know Roman Gabriel, or maybe they'll know Joe Namath from TV ads, but
they wouldn't even know Frank Tarkenton.
Right, you're right.
Yeah, no, they might not even know guys like John Elway and Dan Marino might be past their visage, even stuff from the 80s. Joe Montana's just lucky he won 4 Super Bowls, or else he'd probably been forgotten by now too. So it's
that little thing to catch.
But the recency bias thing is something
that's few and far between.
I feel like wrestling suffers from it almost more than almost any other sport out there, because of how much people, and I think a lot of that to blame is on the WWE. They really just focus on these younger guys and the newer guy, and saying things like Roman Reigns is the longest lasting champion.
Something, I don't know, David and Ev, I don't know if you saw it. I'm pretty sure Ev and I talked about it. They had a video montage when Roman Reigns was passing 1,000.
Yes, and all the guys. That he passed.
Well done. And there were a few left off that I told their archivist, Ben, about, that were left off because he was the one that oversaw that whole video with the photos of Dory Funk Jr., Jack Briscoe, people in there. I go, why didn't you include Giant Baba and all of his title reigns and length of championships in All Japan? And he admitted, they dropped the ball there. But that was well done. What their usual paintbrushing that Evan and I talked for years, decades on various radio programs about the whitewashing or the reimagining of history. Let me just say this about historians. There are a bunch of guys, some in particular, that are newbies that only started watching wrestling from, the late 90s on, that upload other people's video content. We're talking, if they get their hands on like an old, handheld stuff from the 70s and they put it up there on YouTube, they're calling themselves historians when they're like video pirates. They're thieves. That's not a historian. Historian is like Ed Garea going in to, or we lost, Don Luce was another great historian like J. Michael Kenyon that would spend like a whole week in a library, as Evan said, going through microfiche, which I'm sure Evan has done. I've done a little of that, but nothing to that extent like that Ed did, that would just, every single newspaper that had, he would go through the results and all of that stuff and do the best with what you have, and then try to run that by the people still alive. We don't have that many territory guys left.
Yeah.
Dory, I mean, who do we have? Dory, Terry's memory is sadly kind of shot depending on the day. There's just not that many guys. Les Thatcher is probably the guy with the sharpest mental capacity of anybody from that era who's still alive, wrestled in the 60s. Evan and
Bob Ellis is still alive.
Yeah, but nobody's talked to him in decades. He no-showed. He was going to be our top Cauliflower Alley honoree.
Spiros Arion, I heard, is still alive.
No, he passed.
Really?
Yes.
Somebody told me just the other day he's alive. You know for sure?
Yeah, I remember Meltzer doing an obit on him, but we can go back and check. But Bob Ellis hasn't. The legend about him that I'm sure was bullshit was that he was constantly on the move. That's why he didn't come to get his plaque at Cauliflower Alley. He hadn't paid his taxes, a la Ray Stevens, one of his good friends from and was constantly on the move. But he's like the oldest living. There's, I think, one guy in Japan, maybe one in Mexico, in that ballpark.
Spiros Arion is still alive. Mike, you've buried him too quickly. Spiros is still alive. He's 82.
You're sure about that? Because I thought
I just looked it up. Well, Wikipedia hasn't lied to me yet on somebody's death. They get a lot of things wrong, but when someone dies, they usually don't miss the beat.
Black Woodman's still alive. Johnny Rods.
Yeah,
Paul Vachon.
Yeah, Paul Vachon, though, he's lost a leg, just like Ed, and he is asked.
He's still mentally sharp.
But he said, though, that he was asking people to post their memories on his Facebook because he was starting to forget a lot of stuff, which is tragic. What a brilliant career. A lot of people don't know. He worked against Singh in India, and he said, like, they drew, there was, most of it was unpaid, but 120,000 people to see him against, it was a Dara Gama Singh, Dave, do you?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I mean, the interesting thing is, like, these guys were too busy making a living to really reflect on what their legacy was, and that's what I always got a kick out of when I would interview these guys for Wrestling Perspective, and like one time I interviewed Gordon Soley one time, and I was politely correcting him on something, and he says, "You know my career better than I do," and meaning as a compliment, and I said, well, sir, I'm sure I do, because you were too busy actually experiencing it and working, 2 or 3 different territories at the same time, trying to keep everything straight, for that upcoming week. Whereas for me, I was sitting there, as a kid, just marveling at what was in front of me, and so you can't blame some of them for not recalling everything, because they were just too busy doing what they were doing and making a living to worry about what their legacy was. And like I said, for me, for example, I will occasionally come across an article I wrote 10, 15 years ago, and online, that I just happen to stumble across as I'm looking for something else, and I'll click on it and I'll look at it, and I'll have absolutely no recollection of writing the story or speaking to any of the people who were involved in this article. So I could understand, to a certain extent, not remembering days and dates and particular things that happened to you, particularly if me as a fan, it was something that so hugely impacted me. But for you, it was, something that was somewhat interesting and was a decent payday among, a dozen other decent paydays, or 2 dozen or 3, depending on how big the person was. I know for like a Lou Thez or Bruno Sammartino, for example, when you're constantly traveling throughout, going to Japan, traveling throughout the country, and doing a variety of sellout crowds and having all this success, your memory is just not going to be 100% on that.
No, they were doing it.
Can I just add something? When you talk about legacy, this is rarely addressed. Pro wrestling, my radio mentor, Fred Giabold, who's also gone, he referred to wrestling as the proletarian performance art, theater for the people. My grandfather was an immigrant. He came to America about 100 years ago, and, blue-collar jobs, tough life, low pay, and they didn't have money for Broadway. They went to wrestling. And even me as a kid, I went to wrestling with my dad, and my dad never broke 25 grand as a taxi driver. So some of the best nights of my life were going to wrestling with my dad as a kid. So, and who are our heroes? Bruno and Monsoon and Strongbow and, all the Pedro. And I'll take it to the next step. Vince McMahon Sr., it was very ethnic. You had the Puerto Rican champion, the Polish strongman, the Italian strongman. There was somebody for all of us. And, so the
legacy. More Jews.
Yeah, they needed some Jewish wrestling.
Yeah, I'm going to do
one for you and me, Evan. But
well,
they did.
I'm going to do an article on that, actually. I'm the senior editor of Pro Wrestling Stories. I'm going to do an article on that because that's something that's not really acknowledged. Believe it or not, Randy Savage and Lanny Poffo, their mom was Jewish, so technically they were Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, the Malenkos and
there's a Jewish legacy in wrestling. But anyway, my point is, yes, these guys were on the road 300 plus days a year back in the day, and it all.
Somewhere I heard it was 350 days.
That was the NWA champs, but most of these guys 300 plus days, really. And
well, there were weeks they do 8 shots.
Yeah. So my point is, what was just another day at the office for them, these were some of our greatest memories, and that's why we cherish them. And again, that's why somebody like Ed Garea was and is important, because great writing and great journalism and great research survives one way or the other. Somebody's going to Google some wrestler, and there will be Ed's article from Wrestling Perspective or whatnot, and it'll live on forever. No, I'm not just saying this, I mean this sincerely. Art survives. Art survives. And the clickbait review of Friday SmackDown, that's just, garbage for the universe that won't survive because it's meaningless. Really.
So while we have a few minutes left, David, I'd like for you to be able to talk about what you're doing right now, and if you have any contact information so that our fans can get a hold of you, go ahead and.
Like I said, I'm out of doing wrestling, and I like I said, I got very, very close to Ed when I really started loving cinema again, and exploring foreign films as well as trashy psychotronic stuff, and Ed was an expert on all of those things. So we did the Celluloid Club website for like 4+ years, writing about films. I live near Youngstown, Ohio, and I've been writing for the same newspaper now for 28 years, and enjoying life. And
what do you normally write about, Dave?
What's that?
What are your topics? What do you normally write about, or is it everything?
I cover primarily politics and city government in Youngstown, but I do like local politics. I do state politics. I do national politics.
Oh, for which paper?
So what was that?
For which paper?
The name of the paper is called The Vindicator.
Great. So people could
look that
up online.
like a superhero type of name.
Yes.
That sounds like a Grindhouse film, The Vindicator.
Yeah, it does sound like a Grindhouse.
Well, then you've got the Cleveland Guardians, so yeah, you really got you need the Avengers somewhere involved, and you've got yourself. But so people could look up the Vindicator newspaper online and see your articles.
Yeah, at vindy.com.
Great. That's wonderful. We really appreciated having you on as guest.
It's a thrill. Thank you so much.
This week, and sometime, hopefully under happier circumstances, we can have you come and give us some of your thoughts on the modern wrestling world, and let us know what your thoughts are with all of that. So
Great.
Really appreciate it very much. And
Thank you.
I guess we will see everybody next week, or we'll see.
Well, let's see. Ev, do you have anything to plug besides Pro Wrestling Stories? Any
yes.
Our coolest books?
You can check out the Wrestling Then and Now documentary, Plex, Tubi, Amazon, etc. We just re-released that after 20 years. And again, David, we made this movie on pennies 20 years ago, and most of the people in it are gone. Killer Kowalski, Nikolai Volkov, Don Dr. Death Arnold, tons of indie guys. They're all gone.
Of the 50 or 60 guys or 70 guys that I interviewed over the 18 years of doing Wrestling Perspective, an overwhelming majority of them have passed. Just like 70% of them are dead.
Well, that's why you have to get a word from them while they're still here.
Exactly.
Or else, you won't have anything else to remember him by. Anyway, thank you so much for being on the show. We'll see everyone again next week. Good night, everybody.
Bless Aunt Garea.